On the edge of Ivy Lane stood a narrow, ivy-draped cottage, known for its picturesque charm and persistent quiet. The cottage belonged to Miss Eliza Travers, a retired Latin teacher with a fondness for wildflowers, who lived alone except for a canary and the occasional visit from her niece. The windows were always curtained, the gate always locked, and yet on a fog-laced Monday morning, a delivery boy found something that would crack open the piece of Ivy Lane like an egg on cobblestone. The boy, unable to gain entry for the usual parcel drop-off, peered through the letterbox. What he glimpsed inside sent him stumbling back down the front path in a blind panic, yelling for help. When the constable arrived and broke open the door, he found Miss Travers sprawled on the parlour floor, motionless, her mouth slightly parted as if in mid-lecture, eyes open and unblinking. The room was locked from the inside, all windows latched. The chimney flue shut. There was no sign of forced entry, no weapon visible and no struggle. And yet Miss Travers was unmistakably dead. At first glance it seemed natural causes might be at play, perhaps a stroke or a heart failure. But the village doctor, summoned hurriedly, shook his head after examining her. He found no signs of trauma, no marks of poisoning or struggle, but also no indication of a medical event powerful enough to still the heart so cleanly. It was her expression that troubled him, one of faint, puzzled alarm. And something else too, clutched tightly. In her right hand was a button, not her own. It was made of tortoiseshell, old-fashioned, and polished smooth from years of use. None of Miss Travers' clothes bore matching buttons. Her niece confirmed she had never seen it before. It didn't belong in the house. The room offered few clues. Books lay stacked neatly on a walnut shelf. A kettle sat cold on the hearth. The canary cage, curiously, was covered with a dark towel, though it was morning. And on the writing desk rested a sheet of paper, blank except for the oddest phrase penned in an uneven scrawl. "The garden lies within." No one could make sense of it, the villagers whispered. Miss Travers had been odd, yes, but not unwell. The locked door and the foreign button turned the event from tragedy to puzzle. When the local police failed to determine a plausible cause of death, the coroner ruled it undetermined, and the constable, in quiet desperation, sent word to St. Mary Mead. It took little persuasion for Miss Marple to agree to travel the few miles to Ivy Lane. She arrived 2 days later with a small handbag and her usual gentle smile, observing everything on the walk from the gate to the cottage with a seemingly distracted air. Miss Marple entered the parlour slowly, pausing in the doorway. She noted the position of the chair, slightly angled away from the window, and the faint scuff on the wooden floor beneath it. She studied the unlit hearth, the towel on the birdcage, the arrangement of paperweights on the desk. She examined the lock, turning it with gloved fingers. Perfectly functional. Then she picked up the tortoiseshell button, holding it to the light. "Not modern," she murmured as if to herself. "Possibly Edwardian. Certainly male." She asked to see Miss Travers' belongings. Her wardrobe yielded nothing missing. The niece, a quiet girl named Clara, mentioned her aunt had been distressed a week earlier, had spoken of seeing someone in the garden after dusk, but dismissed it as imagination. No footprints had been found. It was on the third visit to the cottage that Miss Marple noticed something she had missed before. The fireplace bore no ash, no scent of soot. But beside the kettle on the hearth, a faint ring of soot lined the bottom of the teapot. Someone had boiled water, then cleaned the fireplace afterward. Too clean. She looked up at the narrow chimney, then at the covered birdcage. "Would you be so kind," she asked the constable, "as to examine the canary?" He pulled off the towel. The canary stood frozen, one eye open, head cocked at an unnatural angle. "Dead," he said. "Poor thing." Miss Marple said nothing, but she stared at the blank paper on the desk, reading the phrase again and again. "The garden lies within." It seemed nonsensical, unless one assumed the writing was hurried, nervous, possibly coerced. Or she leaned in, written in the dark. She requested a candle be brought. In the dim light, the indentation of another phrase beneath the main line became barely visible. A second sentence, scribbled over and erased. With careful pressure, she shaded it gently with a graphite pencil. The words rose, faint but legible. "I heard him on the roof." Miss Marple's lips tightened. She paced the room in a slow circle, stopping at the bookshelf. One volume was pushed slightly forward, Ovid's Metamorphoses. She tugged it free. Inside the cover was a photograph, black and white, folded thrice, slightly cracked at the edges. It showed a younger Miss Travers seated on a garden bench, beside a man with a familiar face. He wore a three-piece suit with matching tortoise-shell buttons. She tucked the photograph away. Her eyes moved to the chimney again. "Did anyone search the roof?" she asked. The constable admitted they had not. It was steep, difficult to access, and there had been no sign of disturbance. But within the hour, a ladder was found and raised. What they discovered atop the ivy-draped tiles brought a fresh chill to the case. A pair of rubber-soled shoes, damp from recent rain. A leather satchel containing gloves, string, and a small bottle labelled chloroform. And nestled into the moss by the chimney's edge, another button. Tortoise shell. A perfect match. Miss Marple stood at the gate watching as the items were brought down. "Someone entered through the chimney," she said quietly. "Lowered themselves into the room when Miss Travers was writing. Lightly covered the cage to keep the bird from calling out. The teapot, yes, they used the fire to mask the scent. But she heard him. Saw him, perhaps. Enough to reach for a button, enough to leave us a riddle." The constable frowned. "But why go through all that trouble?" Miss Marple sighed, her gaze fixed on the blank paper. "Because some crimes are rehearsed in solitude, and some secrets buried long ago must stay buried. For those who cannot afford to be seen at the front door, a chimney may seem the only path in." She looked toward the photo again, now tucked away in her handbag. "And some gardens, I fear, are better left outside." Miss Marple returned to the cottage the following morning, greeted by a low mist curling between the hedges of Ivy Lane. The constable, standing at the front gate, tipped his hat and looked hesitant. "We've found no name to match the photograph," he admitted, "and no signs of forced entry other than the chimney business. Nothing seems stolen. Clara says nothing's missing at all." Miss Marple gave a soft nod and entered the house again, asking gently to speak with Clara alone. The niece, pale from sleepless nights, clutched a handkerchief with reddened knuckles. Her eyes darted between the mantelpiece and the writing desk, as if expecting her aunt to materialize. "You said your aunt was distressed, dear," Miss Marple began gently. "About someone in the garden?" Clara nodded. "She saw someone 2 nights in a row, said she thought it might be one of her old pupils. But when I asked more, she just laughed and said it must have been the moon playing tricks." Miss Marple pressed slightly. "And had she been corresponding with anyone lately?" "No one. She wasn't much for letters anymore." Miss Marple glanced at the writing desk. A letter opener sat across a blotter, immaculately clean. Nearby, an ink pot was closed, the nib of the pen dry. "Strange," Miss Marple murmured. "She wrote that phrase on the paper, yes? But there's no evidence she wrote anything else that day." She bent forward. "Not even a diary entry. Would you say your aunt was the type to make notes? Lists? Plans?" "Every morning," Clara answered quickly. "She always wrote lists, shopping, books to reread, things to mend. It was a ritual." "And yet that morning," Miss Marple said softly, "nothing but, 'The garden lies within,' and something crossed out." She straightened up. "May I see her bedroom?" Clara led her upstairs to a small, orderly room. The bed was made with military neatness. Beside it stood a nightstand on which rested a Bible, a glass of water, and a pair of reading spectacles. A thin layer of dust coated the glass, untouched. Miss Marple reached for the Bible, flipped through the pages, and paused at a small slip of paper used as a bookmark. It held a handwritten quote, "What lies beneath the rose must never bloom again." No signature, just the words in delicate cursive. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Did your aunt keep this quote in her Bible for long?" Clara frowned. "No, that's not hers. I've never seen it before." Downstairs, the constable was inspecting the chimney again with a pair of labourers. "We've sent the button and bottle for analysis," he told Miss Marple, "and we'll run the fingerprint brush, though I don't expect much off moss-covered boots." Miss Marple nodded absent-mindedly. Her attention was on the hearth. She knelt, examining the bricks, and drew her gloved hand across one near the base. It moved slightly under pressure. She looked up. "May I borrow your pocket knife?" With careful prying, she lifted the loose brick. Beneath it was a small cavity. Inside, neatly folded in oilcloth, lay a faded school photograph and a yellowed letter addressed only as "To Eliza, should you need to remember." She unfolded it. The writing was hurried, panicked. "If he returns, don't speak. Don't look him in the eyes. He's not the same. Hide this where only you'll know. I saw what he did. They'll never believe it. You must forget what happened to Margaret." Miss Marple exhaled slowly. "Margaret?" she asked aloud. Clara stepped forward, her face paling further. "Margaret Alston, Aunt Eliza's friend from years ago. They taught together. Margaret left the village after some kind of breakdown. She never came back. I was a child then." Miss Marple held the photo up. Two women, Eliza and Margaret, stood with a group of students in front of a crumbling archway. One student in the front row caught Miss Marple's attention. He was older than the others, tall, with a lean, angular face and piercing eyes. In the photo, he had one hand tucked behind his back, but she could see the edge of a walking cane, barely in frame. "Do you recognize him?" she asked Clara, tapping the photo. "I think that's Leonard Fisk. He was in Aunt's class when I was very small. He disappeared, didn't he? Went away to some asylum?" Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. "Did he now?" She asked the constable for records, but he shook his head. "Name doesn't appear in anything recent. Nothing in parish files either." She asked next to see the garden, the one Miss Travers had mentioned seeing someone in. The grass was still damp with dew. Near the edge of the fence stood an old stone planter, cracked at the base. As she neared it, Miss Marple noticed something embedded in the soil, a shiny corner of glass. Digging slightly with her fingers, she unearthed a small pocket mirror. The back was dented, but the initials LF were still faintly etched on the side. Inside the case was a fragment of hair, short, dark and clinging to the edge with a speck of dried blood. She turned it over in her hand. "Someone watched her," she whispered. "Not from the garden, but from here. Every night. Close enough to see through the window, but never be seen." Back inside, she returned to the photograph once more. The student's eyes seemed too sharp, too alive, even on paper. And then she saw it, a shadow in the background. Behind the group, half obscured by the archway, stood a third figure. It was difficult to see, but Miss Marple's fingers traced the silhouette. A man with a walking stick turned just slightly toward the camera, his face blurred as though he had moved at the last second. It wasn't the student, it was someone older, perhaps 20 years older. But his stance, shoulders stooped, head turned slightly downward, was unmistakable. The same as the man from the roof photograph. Same coat, same tortoiseshell buttons. Miss Marple stood in silence. The deception had begun long ago. Someone had returned not just to kill, but to erase. The misplaced quote in the Bible, the erased message on the desk, the covered cage. All were carefully chosen distractions, meant to delay, not deceive. Someone had been hiding in plain sight, not for hours or days, but for years. Watching, waiting. She turned back to Clara, whose expression was tense. "Has anyone come asking about your aunt in the last few months? A stranger in the village?" Clara hesitated. "There was a man a few weeks ago, asked about renting rooms. But when I said the house wasn't for let, he just smiled and said he'd be back." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Did he walk with a cane?" Clara nodded. "Yes. How did you know?" Miss Marple didn't answer. She was already pulling on her gloves. The picture was taking shape, piece by piece. But the frame it sat within remained just out of reach. And she sensed with quiet certainty that someone in Ivy Lane had already seen the whole image and chosen to pretend otherwise. Miss Marple requested that the constable arrange for her to speak with everyone who had visited or contacted Miss Travers in the week leading up to her death. She also asked to revisit the roof once more, alone. But first the voices had to be heard, the pieces laid out, even if some were smudged or bent to fit someone's advantage. The first to arrive at the station's side room was Clara, still pale and withdrawn, her eyes rimmed with doubt and dread. "I know I've already told you what I remember," she said, settling into the wooden chair, hands nervously folded. "But maybe there's something I missed." Miss Marple listened carefully, not interrupting as Clara repeated her account of the day before the death, how her aunt had spent most of it indoors, how she'd declined a visit to the grocer and insisted on staying home despite the rain, and how she had seemed distracted. "She looked out the window a lot," Clara said, "almost like she was waiting for someone. But she never said a name, just, 'He knows where to find me.' I thought it was nonsense." Miss Marple nodded. "You mentioned someone came around a few weeks ago inquiring about the house." Clara hesitated. "Yes. He didn't give a name. Just said he used to know the Travers family. I told him my aunt didn't receive callers, especially not unannounced. He said he'd write, but no letter came." "And you never saw him again?" "No." "But," Clara frowned, "there was a cigarette butt near the garden gate the next day. Aunt Eliza didn't smoke, and neither do I. The second person brought in was Mrs. Giddens, a neighbour from across the lane. A woman of sharp eyes and sharper gossip, she leaned forward, eager to share. "I saw a man outside the house the night before it happened," she announced with relish. "Tall, limped slightly, stood in the shadows near the hedge. I nearly called out but thought better of it. Never know who's lurking about these days. He was gone by the time I fetched my husband. Miss Marple asked gently, "Did you see his face?" "No, just the shape of him. Had a cane, I think. Moved stiffly, like someone with an old wound." "And you didn't think to mention this earlier?" Mrs. Giddens sniffed. "Well, no one asked, and I didn't want to accuse anyone. I thought maybe it was a delivery man or someone checking the meter." Miss Marple thanked her and asked for the next name on the constable's list. Mr. Ellis, the village handyman. He had done occasional repairs for Miss Travers, mostly in the garden and roof tiles. He arrived with dirt still clinging to his boots and a vaguely annoyed air. "I hadn't been up there in over a month," he grunted when asked about the roof. "Last time I fixed a loose tile over the chimney. That woman never liked strangers in her house, so I kept to the outside." "Did you notice anything unusual? Footprints? Signs someone else might have used the roof?" "Bird droppings, moss, the usual. Wouldn't be easy climbing up there, not unless you had reason." Miss Marple leaned in. "And if someone did have reason?" Ellis shrugged. "Then they'd need a rope or nerves of steel. That chimney's narrow. You'd get stuck coming down without knowing the angles." "And you shared that knowledge with Miss Travers?" His brow creased. "I told her. She asked after the dimensions last time I was up there. Said she didn't trust it with the flue closed so often." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "That doesn't strike you as unusual?" A retired school teacher, concerned about chimney dimensions. Ellis looked uncomfortable. "Now that you mention it." The next visitor was Reverend Fielding, a gentle-faced man in his late 60s with a soft voice and a worried brow. "Miss Travers hadn't been to service in months," he admitted, "though I did stop by last week to deliver some parish notices. She seemed distracted more than usual." "Did she say anything that caught your attention?" Fielding rubbed his chin. "Only that she believed she'd made a mistake long ago, that it had come back to find her. I thought she was being poetic. Eliza always did have a taste for drama. But now—" Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, then asked, "Did you notice anything in her demeanor? Nervousness, suspicion?" "Paranoia, perhaps," he said quietly. "She glanced at the windows too often. Said she kept them shut because someone had been watching her from the trees." Miss Marple glanced at the constable, who was taking notes. A pattern was forming, one that grew narrower and colder with each retelling. Everyone remembered her unease. Everyone sensed a presence. But no one had truly believed her. She asked to speak with Thomas Giddens next, Mrs. Giddens' husband. A quieter man, older, slower to answer. He fidgeted with his cap as he spoke. "She waved at me once, 3 days before, you know. I was on the ladder trimming our hedge. She called over, asked if I still had that old ladder of mine, the one with the tall reach. I told her I did. And what did she say? She said to keep it somewhere safe, that I might need to lend it soon. Odd, really." Miss Marple paused. "Did she borrow it?" "No, but the next day I found it moved. Like someone had used it in the night and propped it back without asking." Miss Marple's expression did not change. But inside, the weight of the evidence shifted. As the sun lowered, and the last of the statements were gathered, Miss Marple stepped into the garden again, her thoughts ticking methodically. The lies weren't loud. They were quiet omissions, moments skipped over, details downplayed, reactions just a bit too polished. Clara's sincerity was real, but incomplete. Mrs. Giddens had seen too much not to report it, yet waited. Mr. Ellis knew chimney measurements that Eliza shouldn't have needed, and somewhere behind each answer was a single thread of control, a subtle hand guiding memories, dampening urgency, feeding confusion. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the garden, her gaze lifting to the roof where the moss still clung to broken tiles. She didn't need a confession to know that someone had come down that chimney with the intention of erasing something only Miss Travers remembered. But they'd overlooked one thing. Miss Travers remembered everything, and she had left breadcrumbs, not in letters or diaries, but in other people's words, words that now whispered of guilt and manipulation. The garden lies within, but the truth, Miss Marple knew, was hidden in plain sight, behind a voice too calm and an answer too well rehearsed. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the garden, hands folded over the handle of her parasol, her eyes tracing the outlines of the cottage roof. The moss-covered slates bore no fresh scarring, yet her mind lingered not on footprints or tools, but on words half-spoken, oddly timed, too smoothly delivered. Every account had sounded reasonable in isolation, but placed side by side they clashed. Mrs. Giddens claimed to have seen a stranger near the hedge on the night before the death, but Clara insisted her aunt had been indoors and calm that evening. Mr. Ellis said he hadn't been on the roof in weeks, yet Eliza had asked him about chimney dimensions only days earlier. And Reverend Fielding's recounting of Eliza's confession about a mistake, about something coming back, echoed almost too neatly with the handwritten quote Miss Marple had found in her Bible. Someone was tailoring the story just enough to blur the shape of the truth. Back inside the house, Miss Marple returned to the desk and opened the bottom drawer once more. It was filled with ordinary things, paperclips, dried inkwells, 2 dull fountain pens, but tucked beneath an old utility bill was a letter, folded and heavily creased. It was unsigned, undated, just a few lines typed. "You cannot bury the Guy. Past, Miss Travers. I know what happened to Margaret. You watched and did nothing. I will see you soon." Miss Marple read the words twice, then a third time. The typewriter ink was smudged, possibly by damp fingers, and the page had been torn, not cut, ripped hastily from a sheet. The spacing suggested a manual typewriter, older make. She made a mental note to inquire at the post office. If the letter had been mailed from the village, there might be a record. Returning to the constable's office, she asked for Clara again. The girl sat with slumped shoulders and trembling fingers, but her voice remained steady. "No, I never saw a letter." "Like that," she insisted, "but Aunt Eliza did seem preoccupied lately. She'd look over her shoulder as if someone might be there. I thought it was just age." Miss Marple studied her. "Tell me, Clara, do you remember Margaret Alston?" Clara looked confused. "Only faintly. I know Aunt Eliza taught with her for a few years. She left the school suddenly. There were rumours, of course, but no one ever said what happened. Rumours. Some said she had an affair with a pupil's father. Others claimed she caught someone cheating and was forced out. I was young then. It was all whispers and closed doors. And after she left, no one saw her again. I think she moved north to York, maybe." Miss Marple gave a soft hum, then asked, "And did your aunt ever speak of her?" "Only once. She said Margaret was a victim of her own kindness, that she trusted the wrong man." Miss Marple's eyes didn't leave Clara's face. "Did she mention who that man was?" Clara shook her head. "No." The Reverend was called back next, and Miss Marple asked him directly about Margaret Alston. Fielding frowned. It's not something I'm proud to speak of, Miss Marple, but yes, I remember her. Bright, compassionate, and deeply troubled toward the end. She came to me once, just after she left the school. She was shaken, said she'd discovered something about one of the pupils, Leonard Fisk, and feared he was dangerous. I tried to advise her, but then she vanished. She accused him of what exactly? Fielding hesitated. She didn't say plainly, only that he had a darkness about him, that he was capable of cruelty. Said Eliza wouldn't listen, but the boy disappeared from school records around the same time, and there was no police inquiry, Miss Marple pressed. And what became of him? Rumor had it he was sent to a facility in the South. Mental health, they said. I never heard of him again. Miss Marple turned the photograph over in her handbag. The young man with the rigid posture, the blur behind the arch. She had not yet confirmed if they were the same person, but her instinct whispered that the past had doubled back on itself, and someone had returned, not merely to kill, but to revisit a wound left to fester too long. Back at the station, the constable had managed to pull the school's personnel files from the archives. In them, a faded disciplinary record detailed an incident involving Leonard Fisk, aged 16 at the time, removed from classes after inappropriate behavior toward a teacher. The name was redacted, but the timing aligned with Margaret's resignation. No police report, no follow-up. As the pieces sharpened, Miss Marple revisited Mr. Ellis, this time asking to see the shed behind his cottage. "Why?" he asked with a nervous chuckle. "It's just tools and junk. I find junk often hides more than valuables," she replied sweetly. The shed smelled of oil and old wood. She scanned the shelves until she found what she expected, a battered manual typewriter covered in a cloth. She pressed a key. The ink ribbon still smudged thickly, and the spacing matched the letter found in Eliza's desk. She said nothing, only smiled gently as she turned back. "I sometimes write for the parish newsletter," Ellis offered quickly. "Recipes and such, that's all." Miss Marple responded only with a nod. "Have you lived here long?" 22 years. Came after the war, took over after my uncle passed. "And you knew Miss Travers well?" He gave a shrug. "I fixed her gutters and cleared her garden. That's about the extent of it. But she trusted you enough to ask about chimney measurements. She was just curious. That's all." Miss Marple didn't press further, but as she left the shed, her thoughts tumbled. Ellis had motive, perhaps revenge, perhaps protection. If he was related to someone involved with Margaret's fall from grace, or if he himself was someone Eliza had wronged, then Eliza's death might have been years in the making. But that didn't explain the button, the canary, the phrase scrawled in dim ink. No single motive explained all the threads. Mrs. Giddens might have lied to cover someone. Clara might have withheld something to protect a memory rather than a person. Reverend Fielding may have buried truths in the name of discretion, and Ellis had a typewriter. Back at the cottage, Miss Marple returned to the photo once more. She took it outside, near the planter where she had found the mirror, and tilted it to catch the fading light. A fingerprint, faint but present, smudged the lower corner. Not Eliza's, someone else's. She had the constable take it for analysis, but her mind already raced ahead. She walked back inside and paused at the writing desk, the blank page with its cryptic line. "The garden lies within," and beneath it, the erased line. "I heard him on the roof." Eliza hadn't tried to leave clues. She had tried to record the truth, even in the face of fear, and Miss Marple now believed that she had been preparing for something. Not a burglary, not madness, but reckoning. She had known the past was circling back, and she had waited, perhaps too long, for someone to believe her. Every person in this village had a reason to stay silent. But Miss Marple's job was not to dwell on silence. It was to hear what was meant to be heard, and she was now certain someone in Ivy Lane had been protecting a secret so old even they no longer realized how far its roots ran. 2 days after Miss Marple discovered the typewriter in Mr. Ellis's shed, the constable returned from the forensic office with what he claimed was a decisive breakthrough. He entered the Travers cottage with a certain spring in his step, a sealed envelope in hand, and a grin not often seen in murder investigations. "We've matched the fingerprint on the corner of the school photo," he announced. "It belongs to Thomas Giddens." Miss Marple turned from the writing desk, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Giddens?" she asked softly, though she already sensed the implications of such a convenient revelation. "Yes. We ran it against his old employment file from the council. Identical print. And the footprint near the chimney, rubber-soled boot, size 9. Matches what he wears. We've taken him in for questioning. And what did he say? Denied it, of course. Claimed he hadn't set foot on Miss Travers' roof. But he had motive. She borrowed his ladder, and he didn't report it missing. He also knew Margaret Alston well. Said he used to visit her before she left the village. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. "And what do you believe?" "I believe we've found our man. He had access, opportunity, a prior relationship with Margaret Alston, and now physical evidence tying him to the house." "It all fits, doesn't it?" Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "It does fit, perhaps too well." But the constable was already out the door, eager to notify the press. By afternoon, word had spread down Ivy Lane that Thomas Giddens had been arrested for the murder of Miss Travers. The village hummed with opinions, speculations, whispered relief that the oddness had been resolved. Mrs. Giddens locked her doors and refused to speak to anyone. Clara cried quietly in her room. Mr. Ellis dropped off the newsletter draft at the vicar's office without saying a word. But Miss Marple sat quietly by the cold hearth, staring again at the desk. Her gaze kept drifting back to the note Eliza had left, the one with the overwritten message. "The garden lies within." She remembered Clara's reaction to the Bible quote, her hesitation around the cigarette butt. Most of all, she remembered Thomas Giddens' gentle confusion when asked about the ladder, his slow, blunt answers lacking the defensiveness she would have expected from someone with a secret to hide. She returned to the constable's office that evening, requesting to speak with Giddens herself. He was seated behind a wooden table, hands resting quietly on his knees, his eyes vacant but not afraid. "I didn't kill her, Miss Marple," he said simply. "You believe me, don't you?" Miss Marple sat across from him. "Tell me more about Margaret Alston." He shifted uncomfortably. "She was kind, misunderstood. We had tea sometimes, talked about her students. She never said who frightened her, but I knew she was being watched. Eliza stopped speaking to her after a while, said Margaret was unstable. But I always thought Margaret saw something the rest of us didn't." "You saw the photograph?" "Yes." "And touched it?" He looked at her, confused. "I gave her that photo years ago. I didn't know she still had it." Miss Marple leaned back. That then explained the fingerprint. Not a recent touch, but one preserved through time. She rose quietly and thanked him, leaving the constable scribbling notes behind her. She returned not to the cottage, but to the post office, where a clerk named Edwin, sharp despite his advancing years, remembered the envelope Miss Marple described. "It came in with 2 others," he said. "One addressed to Reverend Fielding, all typed. Same postmark, same jagged tear at the top." She asked for the Reverend's letter. He retrieved it from his coat pocket in a state of mild confusion. "It was nonsense," he said. "A line from the Book of Job, typed and unsigned. I thought it was a misprint from one of the church boys." Miss Marple read it. "He who digs a pit will fall into it, and he who rolls a stone will have it roll back on him." A warning, not scripture. All 3 letters, she now realized, were sent by the same hand, and all 3 were meant not to inform, but to unsettle, to destabilize. By morning, Miss Marple returned to the Travers cottage one final time. Clara was packing books into boxes. "It feels wrong," she said. "She lived here for 40 years and now it just feels hollow." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Thomas Giddens is not the one who came down that chimney, Clara." Clara stopped. "But they found his fingerprint." "Yes, on a photo he gave your aunt years ago." "And the footprints? A size 9, same as Mr. Ellis, same as your aunt's. Old boots in the garden shed. Plenty of boots go walking about Ivy Lane." Clara's expression darkened. "Then who?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Did you ever enter your aunt's room the night she died?" "No, I slept through until the police came." "Odd," Miss Marple said gently. "There was no key on the inside of the parlour door, yet it was locked. Someone would have needed to take the key afterward to relock it. Unless," her voice softened further, "unless the key had been passed out after the fact. Perhaps even returned before the police arrived." Clara's hands went rigid. Miss Marple continued, "Your aunt trusted you. She told you about Margaret, about the visitor with the cane. You said he came once, weeks before, but the cigarette in the garden was fresher than that. Someone let him in. Someone watched the whole thing unfold, terrified." Clara's lips parted. "You think I think you knew more than you admitted. I think you saw him leave. Perhaps even heard what he said to her. Perhaps you found the note after. Hid it. Or kept it to protect someone. But protecting someone like that only invites them back." Clara's face flushed. "He said he wanted to talk. Said he wouldn't hurt her. Then why did you cover the birdcage?" Clara stared at her. Miss Marple's voice turned quiet. "You went into the room after. Covered the cage. Not before. You saw the canary, its little body, and couldn't bear to leave it uncovered. That's what doesn't fit. The killer wouldn't have cared." Clara's hands shook. Miss Marple took a step forward. "You didn't kill her. But someone used you, Clara, manipulated your loyalty, your silence, and now the village thinks the case is closed." "But it's not," Clara whispered. Miss Marple nodded. "No. He's still out there. And now he knows we almost caught him. He'll strike again, not out of rage, but to erase what's left." Clara dropped into the chair, her breath short and shallow. Miss Marple looked toward the window. The fog had begun to gather again along Ivy Lane. Somewhere in that fog walked a man with a cane, a name long erased, and a silence well practiced. The village had cheered a solved case, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust swift victories. Sometimes they were exactly what the killer wanted: a closed case, a forgotten truth, and a second chance. The morning after Clara's quiet confession, Miss Marple lingered by the garden path of the Travers cottage, her gaze not on the earth, or the house, but on the hedge that separated Eliza's property from the lane. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing a narrow strip of flattened grass running from the base of the back fence toward the wooded embankment that dipped away behind the village. A shortcut, perhaps once familiar to a child sneaking home, or to a man retracing the route of a memory long buried. Back at the vicarage, she requested another meeting with Reverend Fielding. He welcomed her with a weary smile, evidently still unsettled by the previous week's events. "I imagine you're not satisfied with the constable's solution either," he said, as he poured tea with a trembling hand. "No," Miss Marple replied. "Thomas Giddens may be a quiet man with regrets, but I do not believe him capable of descending a chimney and vanishing like smoke." Fielding lowered himself into the chair across from her. "And you believe—" "Someone from Eliza's past returned." "I do. And I believe you know more than you've allowed yourself to admit." The Reverend shifted uncomfortably. "Not intentionally, I assure you, but something has been pressing on my mind. Something I buried years ago, along with the shame of my inaction." Miss Marple listened without a word as Fielding reached for a drawer in the nearby desk. He retrieved an old black notebook and laid it between them. "Margaret Alston came to me the day before she left," he said. "I recorded it here." Her voice was trembling, but she was very clear. She said Leonard Fisk had been visiting her after school hours, uninvited, that he had a key, that he would enter and sit silently, watching her work, saying nothing. She told me she feared him, not because he shouted or threatened her, but because he didn't, because he believed he belonged in every room she entered. Miss Marple turned the pages, reading the neat entries. Margaret had indeed reported Leonard's behaviour, unsettling, obsessive, but the school headmaster at the time had dismissed it as exaggeration and cautioned Margaret not to make trouble. She left the next day. "There was an incident," Fielding said quietly. "A fire in her rooms at the old school. It was minor, extinguished quickly. No one was hurt. But I believe it was Leonard's doing. The boy vanished a week later. No expulsion, no report. Just disappeared." Miss Marple looked up. "Was there a record of his family?" "None local. He was a ward of the county, transferred in from London, we were told. But no surname ever stuck. I think it was changed. Possibly forged." Miss Marple sat back in the chair. "That would explain why no one could find Leonard Fisk in any census or registry since." The Reverend nodded. "I feared speaking of it sooner. Feared what it said about our village, our church, myself," Miss Marple said gently. "Truth delayed is not truth denied, Reverend." She left with the notebook tucked into her bag and returned to Ivy Lane, her thoughts circling the edges of a darker truth. If Leonard had returned, it wasn't merely to silence Eliza. It was to finish a pattern. She called upon the constable, again this time with a more specific request, to search the county records not for Leonard Fisk, but for any men recently released from psychiatric care under a new name, and to cross-reference that with the fingerprints taken from the mirror found in the garden. The call came late that evening. A file had surfaced. A man named Francis Keene, discharged from a facility near Dover 3 months ago, had vanished upon release. The file was thin, but a photograph showed a man with a sharp face, sunken eyes, and a slightly hunched posture. The fingerprint was a match. Miss Marple reviewed the details in silence. Francis Keene had no known family, no listed address, but there was a note written by a nurse, that the man often spoke of gardens, of a woman who knew too much, and of finding a home that was once his, that and the cane he always carried, even when walking unassisted. She closed the file and called Clara at once. "He's not finished," she said, "and you were his witness." Clara sounded shaken. "What do I do?" "Think," Miss Marple said calmly. "Did he say where he'd go next? Mention any other name? Any other house?" Clara was quiet, then said, "He asked once if the old boarding house near the river was still standing. I said I thought it had been turned into a library annex." "Do you know what it was before?" "A school," Clara said. "A long time ago." Miss Marple hung up, her thoughts sharp now, clearing like fog over water. She returned to the village map kept at the parish office and traced a path from Ivy Lane to the river bend. The old boarding house, now barely used, closed for refurbishment since winter, sat alone at the edge of town. She walked there at dawn. The windows were shuttered, but one at the rear had been pried open. Inside, dust thickened every surface, but footsteps had marked the floor in a path toward what had once been the dormitory. On the far wall, scrawled in ash or charcoal, were the words, "She watched. She judged. Now she joins them." Miss Marple exhaled. The room felt cold, not from temperature, but from presence. Somewhere in this space, Leonard, Francis, had relived his youth, rehearsed his vengeance, found comfort in echoes. He had returned, not just to silence a witness, but to reclaim a place in a story where he had once been cast as the villain. And Eliza, by surviving what Margaret had not, had become the last thread of that forgotten chapter. As she stepped back into the morning light, Miss Marple knew the police had closed the case too early. The motive wasn't jealousy. It wasn't greed. It was obsession, sealed decades earlier in a classroom no one had cared to watch. The roots of this murder were tangled in neglect, in the silence of authority, and in a young man who had been lost long before he ever took up a cane. But the killer hadn't vanished. He had paused, waiting to see who noticed, and Miss Marple had noticed. Now she only had to wait, because he would return. Not to the scene, but to the person he believed had finally seen him clearly. And she was ready. Miss Marple stood at the threshold of the disused boarding house, her fingers gently tracing the peeling edge of the windowsill as she turned the moment over in her mind. The scrawled message on the wall, "She watched, she judged, now she joins them," was not just the mark of a disturbed mind. It was deliberate, composed with intent. The grammar was neat, the spacing uniform. This wasn't the wild scratching of a vagrant. It was a message left for her. She had no doubt now that Francis Keene, once Leonard Fisk, had returned to Ivy Lane to relive something more than memory. He had orchestrated a cycle of control, creating a drama in which Miss Travers had played her final part. And now, with Giddens arrested and the village pacified, the man behind it all remained loose, watching, waiting for someone to challenge the false ending. And Miss Marple meant to do exactly that. She returned to the Travers cottage late that afternoon and set the stage with quiet precision. The parlour had been left untouched since Eliza's death, its furniture shrouded in thin dust, the air still laced with a faint trace of dried camphor and burnt coal. Miss Marple unlocked the front door and left it slightly ajar. Then, without informing the constable, she invited Clara, Mr. Ellis, Reverend Fielding, and even the reluctant Mrs. Giddens to tea that evening. The excuse was simple. She needed help sorting Eliza's belongings, and a few familiar faces might ease the burden. They arrived just after dusk. Clara wore her uncertainty like a coat 2 sizes too heavy. Ellis said little but fidgeted endlessly with the hem of his sleeves. The Reverend offered murmured condolences, while Mrs. Giddens hovered near the doorway, clearly more interested in who else might appear than in the boxes of books and linen. Miss Marple kept the conversation light, steering it toward old village stories until they settled into a tired sort of rhythm. Then she offered a tray of tea, but only 4 cups. A small silent error. She handed one each to Clara, Fielding and Ellis, then paused and held the tray toward the empty armchair beside the fireplace. "That's for Eliza," she said softly, setting the final cup down. There was a moment's pause, then a faint, almost imperceptible shift in the air. Outside, the creak of gravel, light footsteps, barely audible, but she saw Ellis stiffen. Miss Marple turned her head slightly. "Francis," she said clearly, not turning toward the door. "Would you like to come in?" The others froze. No one answered. The hallway remained still. Then came a knock. Polite, 2 short taps. Clara gasped. Ellis muttered something under his breath. Miss Marple stood and opened the door. He looked older than his photograph. The lines around his mouth had deepened, his eyes sunk farther into their sockets. The cane, polished blackwood, hung loosely from one wrist. His clothes were plain, brown coat, worn trousers, but his face held the unmistakable calm of a man who believed he was in control. Francis Keene, Leonard Fisk, smiled faintly. "I heard you were hosting a gathering," he said, stepping inside without being asked. "Thought I might stop in. Pay respects." Miss Marple gestured toward the chair across from Eliza's. "There's tea," he sat, glancing at the untouched cup meant for Eliza. "You left her place for her. That's rather sweet." "She was a careful host," Miss Marple replied. "She never liked unfinished conversations." Clara couldn't stop staring. Fielding had gone pale. Mrs. Giddens began to tremble. Ellis hadn't looked up once. Francis took a sip of tea, then leaned back. "I suppose there are things you'd like to ask me." "Only one," Miss Marple said. "Why come back? Not just to kill, but to rehearse?" He smiled. "Because memory fades. But performance, that endures." Eliza watched Margaret fall and said nothing. She wore her silence like a badge. I wanted her to feel what it meant to be erased. Miss Marple let the silence stretch. Then quietly she said, "And the bird?" His brow twitched. "What?" "The canary," she said. "Covered, before or after?" His grip on the cup changed, knuckles whitening. Miss Marple's voice softened. "You didn't know, did you? She kept one. It saw you come down the chimney." It shrieked. "That's why you covered it. Not to hide, but to quiet the guilt." Francis stood suddenly. "You think I feel guilt?" Miss Marple remained seated. "No. I think you feel annoyed. That something as small as a bird interrupted your perfection. That's why you came tonight. Not for closure, for correction. You heard we'd begun talking again. You needed to remind us how the story ends." The room had gone still. Ellis had risen now too, eyes darting toward the hallway. Miss Marple continued, "But Eliza didn't die frightened. She left us her message, and you, for all your precision, missed something." "The mirror," Francis blinked. Miss Marple said gently, "You dropped it near the planter. A careless moment, the only careless one. But that mirror held your fingerprint." His hand slipped to the cane. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Ellis moved now, stepping forward quickly, but Miss Marple raised a hand. "No need." Francis froze. "I've already sent the match to Scotland Yard," she said. "They'll be here by morning." He stared at her. "And you knew I would," she added. "That's why you came. Not to finish it. To be seen. To be understood." Francis held her gaze. Then, for the first time, the calm broke. His voice dropped to a whisper. "She remembered my face. After all those years. Do you know what that does to a man?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "It reminds him that he was never forgotten, only forgiven." The cane dropped to the floor. Outside, the constable approached with 2 plainclothes officers following behind. They entered the room just as Francis exhaled and lowered himself, slowly back into the chair, hands open. Miss Marple stood, collected the untouched teacup and passed it quietly to the officer. The performance was over, but the cracks that had formed, around Eliza, around Clara, around the village itself, would take much longer to fade. Miss Marple knew that some stories don't end with arrests or confessions. They end when someone refuses to let the past slip quietly into shadow. She closed the front door behind her and stepped into the night, where the fog had begun to gather once more. The morning after Francis Keene was taken into custody, a dense silence settled over. Ivy Lane, not the peaceful hush of a solved mystery, but the taut stillness of breath being held. Miss Marple rose early, her mind still turning over details, walking paths she had already explored, looking for what might have been missed. Though Francis had confessed, though the fingerprints and the psychological trail matched, she sensed the case had not yet sealed itself completely. There was something unfinished, something small but essential still floating just beyond reach. She walked to the constable's office that afternoon, intending to review the collected items one final time. The evidence box, she'd been told, had been securely locked in the constable's filing room, containing the mirror, the letter from Eliza's drawer, the scrawled photo, and the school disciplinary notes. But when she arrived, the constable was pacing, his face drained of colour. "It's gone," he said before she even reached the desk. "The whole file, everything from the Travers case." Miss Marple stood very still. "When did you last see it?" "Last night, just after the arrest. I locked it myself. This morning the drawer was broken open. Only that file missing. Was anyone else here?" "Only Sergeant Webb. But he didn't touch it. He swears it." Miss Marple glanced. Toward the filing cabinet where the lock hung broken, the metal splintered at the edges. No sign of forced entry elsewhere. No mess, no disturbance. Just the evidence gone. She said nothing at first, letting the facts rearrange themselves quietly. "And the fingerprint report?" "Still on my desk. But the mirror is gone. The photo, too. Everything tied to Keene." Miss Marple's voice dropped. "Someone wants the story changed, or made to vanish altogether." The constable nodded slowly. "But who? He's behind bars. No visitors, no phone calls." "He may not need them," Miss Marple murmured. "If someone already outside is invested in keeping the past buried." She stepped out into the lane, the sky low and grey above, and turned not toward the Travers house but toward the vicarage. Reverend Fielding answered with his usual tired smile, but she noticed something strange. His expression flickered just briefly at the mention of the missing evidence. "They say the case is over," he said, pouring tea with a slow, steady hand. "Isn't it?" "It should be," Miss Marple answered. "And yet, why remove the items? What could Francis Keene fear now?" Fielding was silent for a moment, then said softly, "Perhaps he wasn't acting alone." Miss Marple looked up. "You believe that?" He nodded. "I didn't want to, but I keep thinking about Margaret. She said she feared the boy, yes, but she also hinted there was someone protecting him, someone at the school." Miss Marple waited. "The headmaster. At the time was dismissed quietly a year after Margaret left," Fielding continued. "No cause ever given. I heard rumours, of course, but nothing formal." "Do you remember his name?" Fielding looked uncomfortable. "It was Gerald Ellis." Miss Marple's gaze did not shift. "Related to our Mr. Ellis. His son took over the family property after Gerald's death." The pieces began to fall quietly into place. Miss Marple excused herself and walked with measured steps to Mr. Ellis's cottage. She found him in the garden, pruning dead branches with mechanical precision. His eyes flicked up when she approached, and he gave a tight, polite nod. "I hear. Congratulations are in order," he said dryly. "You caught your man." "Did I?" she asked, folding her hands calmly. "That's the thing about endings. They tend to invite edits." He paused, clippers frozen in his grip. "The evidence is gone, Mr. Ellis," she said softly, "but not the memory of it." He returned to his pruning. "And what does memory matter in court?" Miss Marple watched him. "I've been thinking about your typewriter, the one you claimed you used for recipes, and the fact that Eliza's letter, threatening her, was typed with that same ribbon." "I told you I loaned it to others." "You did," she agreed, "but no one else would have known the right tone, the precise fear to stoke. Only someone who knew Margaret, who remembered the fire, and who knew how Eliza had kept that photograph. All these years." He didn't look up. "She was going to expose what happened, the protection your father gave Leonard, the removal of Margaret's records, the forced resignation. She kept the files, the letters, and you knew." Ellis exhaled, through his nose. "She wasn't innocent, Miss Marple. None of them were. They let my father take the blame when things got ugly. But they knew. They all knew. She watched that boy spiral and never lifted a finger. That doesn't make her a murderer." "No," Ellis said, "but she created one." Miss Marple's voice was firm. "That boy made his own choices, but you made yours too. You covered for him. You helped him back into the village. You let him in through that chimney." "I didn't think he'd kill her." "No," Miss Marple said quietly, "but you helped him hide, and now you're helping again. The file, the mirror, the photograph." He threw the clippers down, the blades clattering. "I thought if it ended quietly, it would be enough. But it won't," she said, "because he's not finished. Not unless the truth is named." He stared at her for a long time, then turned and walked back into his cottage, the door closing slowly behind him. Miss Marple returned to the constable. "We'll need to search the Ellis property," she said, "but not for a weapon, for the past. And we'll find it not in drawers but in attics, in boxes marked with other names. School letters, dismissal notes, files your department never received." The constable nodded grimly. As the sun lowered behind the rooftops, Miss Marple knew the case had reached its tipping point. The killer had confessed. But the roots were still writhing underground, protected by guilt, silence, and the desperate hope that time would erase all. And now, with the most damning evidence gone, the truth hung by a thread. The village believed the worst was over. But Miss Marple knew better. You don't bury the truth by locking it away. You bury it when no one dares speak it aloud. And someone, somewhere, was still hoping she wouldn't. It was just past midnight when the second call came. Miss Marple had not yet gone to bed, her knitting lying untouched on her lap, the air in her sitting room heavy with unease. The constable's voice on the other end was tight with panic. "It's Ellis," he said. "We found him." The cottage on the far end of Ivy Lane was dark when they arrived, the garden tools still scattered where he had dropped them earlier. The door was ajar, the faint smell of oil and mildew drifting out. Miss Marple entered without hesitation, following the constable through the narrow hallway to the back study. There, beside the hearth, lay Ellis, his body slumped over the desk, one hand still curled around a torn page. A half-drunk glass of whiskey stood beside him. The bottle next to it was open, uncorked, and empty. A small blue vial sat beside the glass. Cyanide, fast, bitter, unmistakable. No note, no farewell. But the page he held was enough. Miss Marple took it carefully, reading the faint imprint of typewritten words. They knew, all of them. Margaret tried to tell. Eliza let her fall. I gave Leonard a roof because no one else would. The fire wasn't an accident. The bottom of the page was smeared, ink and moisture, like a tear had passed. Through the last lines, the constable muttered, "He must have known we were coming back." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "He knew Leonard would come back." On the floor, near Ellis's feet, lay the missing photograph of the school group. Not the copy she'd seen earlier. This one had been altered. Miss Marple turned it over and found that someone had scratched out Margaret Alston's face with a blade. Below the image, scribbled in dark ink, was a single line. "Judgment must be fair." She stood up slowly. "Francis didn't destroy the file," she said. "Ellis did. He thought it would end there. But it never does. Leonard didn't act out of panic. He's orchestrating something larger. This is the next act." The constable looked at her, in alarm. "You think he's still working from inside?" "I think we misjudged him entirely," she replied. "He didn't come back to kill Eliza out of revenge. He came back to reconstruct the story. And now, with Ellis gone, he's taken control of the narrative." The next morning, the village was in a state of hushed horror. Another death so soon after Eliza's, and so closely tied to the same shadowy past, brought the whispers back louder than ever. At the post office, people stood in clusters, debating whether Leonard Fisk had ever really been caught. At the vicarage, Reverend Fielding cancelled service, citing a migraine but sounding more shaken than ill. Miss Marple returned to the Travers cottage once more, where Clara had begun boxing away the final books. "I saw him," Clara said softly, her voice brittle with fear. "2 nights ago, standing at the edge of the trees behind the garden. He just watched." "Did you tell anyone?" "I didn't think he could do anything else. I thought it was over." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "You weren't wrong. You were just ahead of the rest." She walked through the cottage with renewed care. The parlour, the writing desk, the covered birdcage, each space held echoes now of a presence that had never fully left. She went up to Eliza's bedroom, drawn by a strange intuition. The room was clean, almost untouched, but behind the wardrobe something had been pushed hastily into the corner, a stack of folders. School records, disciplinary reports, letters from Margaret, some written in a trembling hand, others never sent. One began, "If something happens to me, tell Eliza the truth will follow her." Another, unsigned, stated, "He watches me now even when—" I close the curtains. I see his shadow on the glass. Miss Marple brought the papers to the constable that evening. She kept them hidden, away from everyone. But Leonard knew. He must have returned for these. Then why not take them? Because he wanted us to find them. After Ellis was dead. After the village felt the case had swallowed itself. The constable shook his head. What does he want then? Miss Marple's gaze hardened. Control. Not just of events, but of memory. Leonard Fisk doesn't just want justice. He wants to rewrite the past as he saw it, with himself as the victim and everyone else as accomplice. And now, he's not finished. He's performing. That performance revealed itself again the next morning, when the church doors were found, flung open and a single object left on the altar, a school badge, tarnished but intact, with the name Fisk engraved on the back. Next to it, a small wooden carving of a canary, painted yellow, its eyes gouged out. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't over. The constable sent for reinforcements. Posters were distributed. The station was placed on alert. But Miss Marple knew they were searching in the wrong way. Leonard didn't need to hide in forests or barns. He lived now through suggestion, through implication. He was ahead of them not by running, but by guiding their footsteps. She returned to the boarding house by the river that night, the one he had claimed in his scrawl as a place of meaning. She entered alone, carrying a candle. In the main room, the chalked words still remained. She judged. She watched. Now she joins them, and, beside it now, a new line, not the last. Miss Marple stood silently for a long moment. Leonard Fisk was not a man content with silence. He needed an audience, and the stage was still set. Another victim would come, not for vengeance, but for ritual, for closure in his twisted sense of it. She left the boarding house and returned to the constable. He's not finished, and the next target won't be chosen randomly. It will be someone who questioned him, someone who knew too much. The constable stiffened. You think it's you? Miss Marple gave a thin smile. I think Leonard Fisk already wrote my name in his final chapter. The only question now is whether I let him finish it. The days following Ellis's death passed with an unnatural stillness, the kind that settles when fear has taken root not in gossip, but in quiet hearts. Ivy Lane, usually so open to chatter, had grown mute. The blinds were drawn earlier. Conversations were clipped, eyes constantly drifting toward the edge of the trees. Everyone knew Leonard Fisk, or Francis Keene, as the records now called him, was still out there. Yet no one could say where. He had become a shadow not of body, but of thought, always lingering just outside the periphery of reason. Miss Marple, however, was not a woman who allowed shadows to dictate her pace. She had spent her days revisiting everything, every word, every corner, every glance. And it was not in some grand reveal or confession that the truth finally turned, but in something almost laughably simple. She had returned once more to the Traver cottage, not expecting clarity, but hoping for peace. Clara had long since moved out, leaving the place as Eliza had left it, books still on shelves, kettle dry, drawers half emptied but not bare. The air held the faint must of old paper and dried lavender. Miss Marple walked the room slowly, absorbing the silences, her fingers drifting over objects. Then she entered the small back garden where Eliza had once grown her herbs. The soil was overgrown, the planter cracked and caved in. But what caught Miss Marple's attention now wasn't the earth. It was a shard of porcelain tucked beneath the hedge. She crouched and retrieved it, smooth on one side, jagged on the other. It was part of a teacup, the kind from the set Eliza had always used when hosting guests. Miss Marple had seen the tray that night Leonard arrived, 4 intact cups, plus the one she had deliberately set for Eliza. But this had not come from the 5. She returned inside and checked the cupboard. 5 cups, matching. Saucers. But there should have been 6, always 6. Eliza had been consistent in such matters, which meant someone had broken one and removed it. Miss Marple sat slowly in the nearest chair, the cup shard in her hand. The cup had not been broken. During Leonard's visit, he had never touched the tea, only stared at it. So when had it been broken? And by whom? She rose and turned to the hallway, her mind now turning more quickly. A missing cup, a broken pattern, a disruption not accounted for in any testimony. She revisited Clara's account of the days leading to Eliza's death, particularly the night she claimed to have slept through the event. But Clara had also mentioned once, offhandedly, that she had tidied the kitchen the next morning before the constable arrived. No one had followed up on that. Why would they? Because Clara had been grieving, because she was frightened. But now Miss Marple realized something far more troubling. Clara had likely been there when Eliza died. Not complicit, not violent, but present. A silent observer to a crime that had already begun and couldn't be stopped. The broken cup had been a panic response, something dropped in shock. And instead of speaking, Clara had hidden it, buried it, the same way Leonard had buried his pain, wrapping it in elaborate performances and scorched memories. But it wasn't the cup itself that mattered. It was the instinct behind hiding it. That same instinct, of cleaning up, of rearranging, was something Miss Marple had seen before. Years ago, in a different village, during a case of a young housemaid who had altered the scene of a theft to protect a man she feared. She hadn't lied directly. She'd simply rearranged enough truth to mislead the story, and Clara had done the same. But why protect Leonard? Miss Marple returned to the notebook she had recovered from Eliza's drawer, the one containing Margaret Alston's unfinished letters. There, toward the end, she found a line she had previously overlooked, hastily scribbled in the margin. He calls her Little Bird. Says she reminds him of someone. Says he can't let her go like the first one. And below that, in shakier handwriting, she's seen him again. She says she doesn't remember, but she does. I saw her flinch when he touched her shoulder. Miss Marple's hand tightened on the page. Clara. She read the note again, now with clarity. Leonard had attached himself to Clara, not because she resembled someone, but because he recognized her. Clara had been a child when Margaret vanished, a child when Leonard was last in the village. But children remember more than adults assume, and Clara, perhaps unknowingly, had always remembered him. Leonard had returned not just to punish Eliza. He had returned because Clara was the loose thread that remained. And as long as she was nearby, the story wasn't finished. Miss Marple stood, and made her way at once to the vicarage, where she found Reverend Fielding in the study. "We need to find Clara," she said, without preamble. Fielding looked up, startled. "She's gone. Left this morning." "Where?" "She said she needed air. Took the path behind the cottage. I thought she'd just gone to clear her head." Miss Marple felt a sudden cold certainty wash over her. "No," she said. "She didn't go for air. She went to find him." They rushed back to Ivy Lane, where the garden gate hung ajar. No one was inside, but near the rear the fence had been shifted, enough for someone to slip through into the woods. Miss Marple stepped through, the path winding downward toward the river where the old boarding house sat abandoned. And on the windowsill, placed, like a stage cue, was the final teacup, unbroken, intact, waiting, a message, a reminder. The pattern had always been there. Tea sets, broken routines, girls called Little Bird. Leonard was not chasing revenge. He was chasing the shape of a story he believed had once belonged to him and had been stolen. And now he was writing Clara into the last act. Miss Marple turned toward the constable as they caught up behind her. "He's recreating it all," she said. "And Clara is meant to replace Margaret. He won't hurt her, not yet. Not until he believes she's seen what she was meant to see." "Then where is he?" the constable asked. Miss Marple looked toward the trees. "He'll be where the story began, where Margaret last stood, in the ruined school courtyard behind the boarding house. That's where he'll bring her." They didn't wait. They ran. The story was no longer a mystery. It was a trap built from memory, one step at a time. And Miss Marple had finally seen the pattern, not just in facts, but in Leonard's fractured logic. Now she only hoped they weren't too late to stop him from writing his ending in stone. The path behind the cottage was overgrown, but clear enough to follow in single file, winding through the brambles and tall grass as it narrowed toward the woods. The light filtered through the trees in faint ribbons, and the silence of the forest pressed close around them, too quiet, too still. Miss Marple moved carefully, but without hesitation. Her steps swift despite her age, her eyes fixed ahead on the barely visible trail that curved toward the river bend and the ruined courtyard beyond. The constable followed close behind, whispering into his radio, though the crackling yielded no response. Their signal was likely dead beneath the heavy canopy, but neither stopped. Miss Marple's instincts had never failed her, and now she could feel it in the air. A final performance was about to begin, and Clara was already on stage. They reached the clearing just as the trees gave way to the remains of the old school. Half buried in ivy, its brick archways stood like rotted teeth, the inner courtyard exposed to the sky, the stones slick with moss and decay, and in the center stood Clara. She wasn't tied, wasn't gagged. She stood perfectly still, hands by her sides, her face pale but composed. Leonard stood opposite her, the cane loose in his hand, his head tilted as though studying a statue. He didn't look surprised to see Miss Marple arrive. In fact, he smiled. "I thought it would be you," he said. Miss Marple didn't speak at first. She studied the space between him and Clara, noting how she hadn't stepped back. She wasn't frozen in fear. She was listening. Leonard raised a hand toward Clara, not touching her but gesturing with faint reverence. "Do you know why I brought her here? Why I let her find the cup, the badge, the carving?" Miss Marple answered quietly. "Because you wanted her to see. You've been building a story, Leonard, one where you are finally understood. He nodded slowly. They called me dangerous, unwell, a shadow of a boy no one wanted to remember. But Eliza remembered. Margaret did. Your friend Ellis did. They all remembered the boy who sat in the corner of the room and said nothing. They feared me because I saw what they didn't, that they were all pretending, that the things they claimed to protect, students, order, dignity, were masks. Miss Marple took a step forward. And what did Clara see? She reminded me of Margaret, Leonard said softly, his eyes distant. Not in face, not in voice, but in silence. She had the same quiet that I once believed meant weakness. But I know now, silence is power. Clara saw me in the garden that night, and she said nothing. She watched me. She let the story unfold, just like Margaret tried to do before they broke her. Clara flinched slightly. Miss Marple looked toward her. "He's not wrong, is he?" she said gently. "You did see him. You knew he wasn't a stranger." Clara nodded slowly. "I remembered his face when he came to the door weeks ago. I remembered it from a photo my aunt once showed me. I didn't know how to explain it. I thought I was imagining it." Leonard turned to her, his voice low. "But you didn't speak. You saw what the others never did. You understood." "No," Clara said suddenly, louder. "I feared what I understood. I didn't protect you. I hid, just like everyone else." Leonard's face twitched. "You didn't stop me. That's what matters. You let me finish." Miss Marple stepped closer. "No, Leonard. What matters is why you needed to finish. You came back not to punish Eliza. That was just the start. You came to recreate something, to rebuild a world where you had power over silence." He stared at her, unmoving. "You were never after revenge," Miss Marple continued. "You were after identity. You wanted to be more than the boy who vanished. You wanted to be the one they couldn't forget." Leonard's hand gripped the cane tightly now. "And so you built this. Murder as theatre. Letters as script. You orchestrated their guilt so you could become its author. You even gave Clara a role. You gave her Margaret's place." "She took it willingly," he said, though the words sounded hollow. "No," Miss Marple said. "She took nothing. You projected onto her a story that was yours alone, but Margaret didn't leave because of you. She left because the system failed her, and Eliza's silence wasn't power, it was fear." Leonard's breath quickened. "You made yourself a symbol," she pressed. "But you forgot that even the most carefully written stories unravel when one character stops playing their part." Clara stepped back now. "I'm not Margaret, and I'm not yours to cast." Leonard turned to her slowly. His face changed, not with anger, but with something more painful. Confusion, disorientation. "But I gave you everything. I gave you a voice." "No," Clara said. "You gave me your trauma." Leonard looked down at the cane, as if seeing it for the first time. His body sagged. "Then what am I?" Miss Marple answered softly. "You're the boy who was forgotten too long, and the man who believed pain was a currency. But what you wanted wasn't justice, it was control. And that's not truth, it's performance." The constable stepped forward at last, slowly, cautiously, his voice firm but calm. "Francis Keene, you're under arrest." Leonard didn't resist. He looked at Clara one last time, but she turned away. And in that final look, something inside him collapsed. The illusion broke. He had written the story perfectly, but he had failed to make anyone believe it. Later, as the village buzzed with the aftermath, Miss Marple sat quietly in the empty Traver cottage, reading the letters Margaret never sent. One line stayed with her. "It is not cruelty that haunts me most, but the echo of someone never taught how to be kind." That, she thought, was Leonard's hidden motive, not vengeance, not rage, but the need to be seen as more than what he had been shaped into. A need that grew so loud, it drowned the line between grief and guilt, past and present. And, now that the curtain had fallen, all that remained was the silence he once thought was power. But Miss Marple, ever the listener, knew the difference. Silence was never the end. It was simply the place where truth waited. The sky above Ivy Lane had dulled to a soft, bruised grey by the time Miss Marple returned from the constable's office. Her step steady, though the weight of what had just occurred hung heavy in her chest. Leonard Fisk, Francis Keene, had not spoken again since his arrest. He sat in the cell with the same quiet posture he'd always favoured. Upright, composed, hands folded in his lap like a student awaiting his name to be called. But there was something in the set of his jaw, the lack of resistance in his eyes, that told Miss Marple this was not his final act. He had not given up the performance. He was simply waiting for the right audience, and Miss Marple had no intention of letting him write the ending. She spent the evening quietly, reviewing every scrap of note she had kept. The forged letters, the mirror, the typewritten threats, and most of all, the pattern Leonard had so carefully constructed over time. She realized something important then. He had never cared whether he was caught. What he wanted was control over the narrative. He wanted to be the one who decided how people remembered Eliza, Margaret, even himself. The murders, the messages, the symbolism, they were all part of that story. But what if someone rewrote the script? By morning she had a plan. The constable raised an eyebrow when she proposed it, but after some convincing, he agreed. Miss Marple knew it was risky. But then again, so was letting Leonard believe the tale he'd constructed would be the one history remembered. That afternoon, she requested that Leonard be brought back, not to the courthouse, but to the Traver cottage. At first he refused. Then he asked one question: "Will she be there?" He meant Clara. Miss Marple said yes. He agreed. The room had been prepared in exact detail. The parlour untouched. The tea set restored to its familiar layout. 5 matching cups with one empty place by the fire. The letter opener on the desk. The Yardar book on the shelf, Metamorphoses, pulled halfway out, exactly as Eliza had left it the day she died. A chair for Miss Marple, one for Clara, and another, directly opposite, for him. When Leonard was escorted in, he paused in the doorway for a moment. Then something odd happened. His posture softened, not with fear or surrender, but with recognition. It was as if he had stepped into a memory. He moved without instruction and sat in the seat that had once been Eliza's. His eyes wandered over the objects in silence. Then he smiled faintly. "You've staged it well," he said. "Better than I did." Miss Marple took her seat without responding. Clara was beside her, quiet but firm, her hands folded neatly. She had chosen to be here, not out of courage, but because she understood now what was needed. Leonard leaned back, eyes half-lidded. "I suppose this is where you ask me why?" "No," Miss Marple said. I already know why. You needed to reshape the past into something that made you more than a shadow. You weren't content with being forgotten. You needed to be the one who remembered for everyone else. He chuckled softly. You say it like it's madness. It's not madness, she replied. It's grief, disguised as justice, warped by years of silence. He looked at her. And what is silence? Miss Marple, if not agreement? Sometimes, she said gently. It's simply the only thing left to someone who was never given the words. He went quiet. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Then he turned to Clara. You still haven't said anything. I'm not here to give you a confession, Clara said evenly. Or forgiveness. No, he said. You're here because you were always supposed to be. Not in your story, she replied. In hers. Leonard looked puzzled. Eliza's, she said. You thought she was afraid. You thought she was a bystander. But she wasn't. She knew you were coming back. She knew someone would try to rewrite what had happened, and she made sure someone else would be here to remember it honestly. Miss Marple reached into her bag and withdrew a letter, the final one Eliza had written but never sent. It had been hidden inside Metamorphoses, sealed, addressed not to the police but simply, "To whom he returns." Miss Marple laid it on the table, before Leonard. Read it. He hesitated, then opened the envelope. The handwriting was neat, resolute. I know you'll come back. Maybe not to hurt me, but to reshape the ending. Maybe to convince yourself that what you became was our doing. But I remember you, Leonard. Not the boy who watched, but the one who wanted so badly to be noticed. He set fire to the curtains just to feel seen. I remember Margaret telling me you followed her down the corridor in silence. I remember the look in her eyes when she said you wouldn't stop. And I remember failing to act, not because I didn't believe her, but because I was afraid of what that failure said about me. If you want the truth, here it is. We failed you, but you chose what came after. He stopped reading. His fingers trembled, slightly. Miss Marple watched him closely. You wanted her to be the villain, but she already knew she'd failed, and she faced it. You couldn't. Leonard looked down, jaw tight. You think this makes it better? No, Miss Marple said. It makes it true. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping back. The constable stepped forward, but Miss Marple raised a hand. Leonard didn't run. He simply stood there, eyes darting to the cold teacups, the familiar hearth, the memory he'd tried to mold into obedience, and saw that none of it had become what he intended. I thought I could make it right, he said at last. I thought if they remembered me the way I remembered them, it would be enough. Miss Marple stood now too. Memory is not justice, Leonard, and it's not love. It's only a mirror, and no mirror can give you what you needed. He looked to Clara one last time. Did I scare you? She didn't look away. Yes, but I'm not afraid now. That was the final fracture. His shoulders sagged. Whatever resistance had remained left his body in a single breath. When the constable took him by the arm, he didn't resist. He left the room as quietly as he had entered, the door shutting behind him like a final line of a play that had run too long. Miss Marple remained standing, her hands lightly clasped in front of her. Clara sat back down. Will it ever feel finished? Miss Marple shook her head. No, but it will stop echoing quite so loudly. And in the quiet that followed, the story, at last, surrendered its grip. The house had gone still again after Leonard was taken away. The silence in the Traver cottage was no longer oppressive. It was exhausted. Miss Marple stood at the window, watching the constable's car disappear into the mist, its red light swallowed by the curve of Ivy Lane. Clara remained seated, unmoving, her face unreadable. The final confrontation had passed, and with it, the long shadow of Leonard Fisk seemed to lift from the village. But as Miss Marple gathered her belongings and glanced back at the parlour, her eye caught something strange. The teacup Leonard had touched was no longer where he'd placed it. At first she assumed the constable had moved it while clearing the scene. But the others were all untouched, still resting neatly in their saucers, the tray undisturbed. Only the one he had held was gone. She turned back to Clara. "Did you move the cup?" Clara blinked. "No, I haven't touched anything." Miss Marple walked slowly to the tea tray. No stain, no stray drop of liquid. She crouched and checked beneath the table. Nothing. Her eyes narrowed. Something was wrong. She stepped to the doorway and called for the constable, who had only just begun to return from securing the perimeter. "Check his pockets," she said. "Now." They returned Leonard to the house minutes later. His expression had changed again, calmer, as if relieved by the request. He didn't resist when they emptied his pockets, producing nothing but a folded handkerchief and a small fountain pen. "Search him properly," Miss Marple said. The constable complied. In the inner lining of Leonard's jacket, concealed beneath the stitch of the inner pocket, was a hollow sewn into the fabric. From it, they withdrew a second envelope, smaller than Eliza's letter, but bearing the same careful cursive. Miss Marple took it. The name on the front was not hers, or Clara's, or even Eliza's. It was Margaret Alston. Inside was a folded sheet of stationery, stiff from age. But the ink was fresh. Miss Marple read the lines aloud, slowly. "You left me before I had a name. You ran. You watched. And then you vanished. They made me their project. But you were the one who knew. You were the one who warned them. You were the one who walked away when it became inconvenient. I saw your face in the church once. I remembered the perfume. You let them think you were a ghost. But ghosts don't write checks. Ghosts don't visit London hospitals in the dark. Ghosts don't pay for silence." She stopped. Leonard looked at her, eyes dark and level. "She didn't die," he said. "Not then. Margaret lived, quietly, for years." The constable stared. "But we found no record of—" "No." Leonard interrupted. "You didn't look far enough. She changed her name, lived in a women's rest home for teachers outside York. She died 2 years ago." Miss Marple looked back at the letter. The implications sank in like a stone in cold water. The story wasn't complete. Margaret hadn't been the victim Leonard had painted her to be, not entirely. She had survived. And someone in the village had known. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "Who paid for her care?" Leonard answered immediately. "Reverend Fielding." It struck her then. The missing pieces. The strange hesitation. The way Fielding had always spoken of Margaret in vague tones, never once referring to her death, always assuming she had vanished or gone north. His discomfort hadn't been simple guilt. It had been involvement. She left the room without another word and walked to the vicarage. Reverend Fielding opened the door with the same worn calm he always wore, but his eyes widened at the sight of her. She stepped inside without asking. "I assume you've come about the letter," he said softly. Miss Marple nodded. "How long did you support her?" "Since the year she left," he admitted. "She wrote to me once from the train. Said she couldn't face anyone in the village. Said she was afraid Leonard would return. I arranged for her to be admitted under an alias, sent money when I could. She didn't want help from Eliza. She hated Eliza," Fielding said flatly. "Felt betrayed. Said Eliza let her be. Thrown to the wolves. And yet," Miss Marple said, "she didn't name you either. She spared me because I listened. Or at least tried to." Miss Marple studied him. "And you never told anyone she was alive?" "She begged me not to. Said if people knew, they'd force her to relive it. She wanted to disappear properly. She never married. Never taught again." Miss Marple turned the letter over in her hands. "But someone else knew. Leonard knew. And he blames her more than anyone." Fielding's voice dropped. "He saw her once. I arranged a meeting after she reached out to him, years ago. She wanted to forgive him. She said it might heal them both, and did it." Fielding closed his eyes. "He never came. He sent her a message. You made me invisible, that's all." Miss Marple stood silently for a moment. "And now," she said finally, "he's trying to make her absence permanent. By blaming her. By punishing the memory of her." Back at the cottage, Leonard had gone quiet again. But when Miss Marple returned, she didn't ask him more questions. She simply sat and placed the letter in her lap. "You know what I think, Leonard," she said. "I think you always knew Margaret survived. You chose not to confront her, not because you were afraid, but because her survival ruined your story. You needed her to be dead. You needed Eliza to be guilty. You needed silence to sound like justice, but she lived, and that undid everything." He didn't respond. "She forgave you, you know," Miss Marple added. "Reverend Fielding said she wrote you a letter." His mouth moved once, but no words came. "You never read it, did you?" He shook his head, just once. "She wrote that you were the boy she feared, but also the boy she pitied. She said she hoped you'd find peace, not redemption, just peace." For the first time since his arrest, Leonard looked truly shaken. He turned away, and the strength that had fueled his grand story began to slip from his face. Miss Marple stood. "You didn't write the final chapter, Leonard. Margaret did, and she chose not to end it in rage." She walked away then, leaving him alone with the letter on the table. Behind her, the door clicked shut. And so, in the final act, the twist had not come in the form of another body or another lie, but in the enduring power of the truth Leonard had tried so hard to erase. Margaret had survived. And with that survival, she had quietly shattered the story he had spent a lifetime writing. Miss Marple returned to her small sitting room at the vicarage after her final conversation with Leonard, a quiet storm brewing in her chest. The village had started to breathe again, finally believing that justice had been done, that the case had been closed. But Miss Marple knew better. The pieces were all in place now, but the puzzle had never truly come together. There were still cracks in the story, gaps in the timeline that others had overlooked. She couldn't shake the feeling that the last chapter was still unfolding. She'd expected the constable to come to her that evening, his footsteps echoing in the hallway, ready to close the case for good. What he didn't know, what they all didn't know, was that there was one more detail, one last thread that needed pulling. The puzzle hadn't solved itself yet. It was too neat, too perfect, too wrapped in a bow. That's when the story felt most false, when it all seemed too obvious, and Miss Marple knew the truth had a way of revealing itself, no matter how many layers of deception one piled on top of it. She sat by the window, gazing out at the street where the mist was starting to curl up around the lampposts, and waited. The knock came just before midnight, Miss Marple, the constable said, breathless, his face pale as he stepped inside. I think you need to see this. She stood, already sensing the change in his tone. This wasn't a routine update. This was something else. Where? She asked, her voice steady despite the sudden anxiety tightening in her chest. His cell, he said, his voice strained. We found something. Miss Marple followed him without a word, walking briskly through the dark streets of the village, the night air heavy with the scent of impending rain. When they arrived at the station, the constable led her to the small, dimly lit holding area. There, in the corner of the cell, was Leonard. His figure was slumped against the wall, still as a stone. At first glance it looked like he was sleeping. But Miss Marple had seen enough to know that nothing about this scene was peaceful. Leonard had been found with a clean slit across his throat, the blood having pooled beneath him like a dark stain spreading across the stone floor. Miss Marple's heart sank, but she forced herself to remain calm, her mind clicking through the possibilities. The constable had already started calling for assistance, but Miss Marple waved him off. He didn't do this himself, she said, her voice calm, but with an edge of finality. The wound is too clean. He was either incapacitated or someone else, someone he knew, did this. The constable frowned, clearly troubled by the sight. But who? We've secured everything. He was alone in the cell all night. Miss Marple looked at the body, her mind racing. There was something about the placement of Leonard's body, the lack of struggle, the neatness of the wound. It didn't fit with the narrative of a final, desperate act. The killer had left behind a clue, a deliberate detail that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. Her gaze moved to Leonard's hands. There, tucked carefully beneath his palm, was a crumpled piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. She knelt beside him, gingerly extracting the paper. It was a letter, hastily folded, the ink smeared in places, as though someone had written it in haste. She unfolded it and read aloud. To whom it may concern, if you have found this note, it means I have failed. It means the last act has not been completed, and I have not been allowed to fulfill my purpose. What I built is not yet finished, but it will be, with or without me. Do not think this is a plea for help. It is not. I do not regret my choices, and I do not ask for forgiveness. But there is one thing left I must correct before the final curtain falls. You will know when the truth is complete. But you may not like it. For the truth, like the story, is what you choose to believe. The paper fluttered in her hands as she finished reading. Her eyes lifted to meet the constable's, who looked at her with a mix of disbelief and confusion. Do you see it? Miss Marple asked, her voice low, barely above a whisper. The constable blinked. The letter, but it doesn't make sense. Who's he writing to? Not to anyone, Miss Marple replied. He was writing to you, to the one who would find it. She looked back at the paper, the ink now clearly imprinted in her mind. It's not the death that matters. It's the message he left behind. You see, Leonard Fisk, Francis Keene, wasn't interested in killing Eliza or Margaret or anyone else for that matter. His obsession was never with revenge. It was with the truth. The constable still looked lost. But how? He's dead. Miss Marple took a breath. Yes, but the truth doesn't die. It lives on in the people left behind, those who continue to tell the story. And in the end, Leonard got what he wanted. His story would never be buried. Not by the authorities, not by anyone. Someone will find this letter. Someone will know he was right about what he said. The constable swallowed, trying to grasp the full weight of what Miss Marple was saying. But the truth. What's the truth, then? The truth, she said, is that Leonard Francis killed to make sure that his story would live on. And in doing so, he left behind one last message, not for the police or the courts, but for the one who would keep his legacy alive. He wanted someone to uncover the final twist, to see that his end wasn't a failure, but a completion of his own design. Miss Marple turned away from Leonard's body, the sense of something more sinister hanging in the air. The truth is not something you can escape, Constable, and neither is the past. It's always there, lingering just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to dig deep enough to find it. She paused, her voice lowering. The real mastermind was never behind bars. It was always someone else. Someone who knew how to shape the story just enough to make it live forever. As they stood in the dim light, the reality of the situation settled heavily around them. The case wasn't solved, not by a long shot. Leonard's death had opened up more questions than it had answered, and in that moment Miss Marple understood. There was no closure. No neatly tied-up ending. Just a continuation of the same twisted narrative, a story that could never fully be finished, because the truth was always evolving, always waiting for the next chapter. And so the detective walked away from the investigation, knowing that the final twist had yet to be revealed. The only certainty now was that someone else, someone still hidden, was always a step ahead, ready to write the next chapter. Miss Marple walked slowly back toward her small cottage, her steps measured, deliberate. The evening air had grown thick with the scent of rain, and the streets of Ivy Lane were empty now, the echoes of the investigation already fading. Yet even as the village seemed to exhale in relief, the weight of the case still lingered in her mind. Leonard Fisk, or Francis Keene as he had become, was dead. The case was officially closed, and yet there was something about the way it had ended, something that gnawed at her. The constable had been content to label it as a straightforward conclusion, a tragic but necessary end. But Miss Marple knew better. There were always details that didn't add up, pieces of the puzzle that slipped through the cracks, unnoticed by others. She paused at the edge of the lane, glancing back over her shoulder at the shadowed outline of the vicarage. It was quiet now, too quiet. And though the case had been solved on the surface, she felt the faintest pulse of an unresolved mystery still humming beneath everything. What, after all, was Leonard's true motive? Revenge, control. It all seemed too neat, too scripted. He had wanted to be remembered, yes. But there was something more, a final twist that had yet to reveal itself. She stopped in front of her cottage, turning the key in the lock, her mind still racing through the events of the past weeks. The puzzle pieces had fit together too perfectly. At times, as if someone had arranged them for her to find. But now, with the case closed and Leonard dead, a nagging thought wouldn't leave her. The letter, the crumpled note she had found in Leonard's pocket. There had been something about it, something unsettling. The words he had written were calm, too calm for a man who had just murdered to silence his past. There was a resignation in the way he had written, as if he had always known this would happen, as if the final act was inevitable. Inside, the fire crackled softly, its warmth a welcome contrast to the chill in the air. Miss Marple sat by the hearth, the quiet of the room settling around her. She set the letter down on the table in front of her, rereading it slowly. If you have found this note, it means I have failed. It means the last act has not been completed, and I have not been allowed to fulfill my purpose. The words felt more like a confession than a final thought. She had read them before, but now they seemed to take on a deeper meaning. Leonard had been trying to control the ending of his own story, yes. But there had been another message embedded in the letter, one that she had missed at first. You will know when the truth is complete, but you may not like it. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, the crackling fire the only sound in the room. A truth that had yet to be revealed? But what was it? What had Leonard left behind that no one had noticed? The pieces clicked together, in her mind, the way they always did when a puzzle had reached its final stage, only to reveal something just out of reach. It was the missing cup. The broken teacup, the one that Leonard had moved, the one that had been removed from the tray, hidden somewhere only he knew. It was so small, so insignificant in the grand scheme of the investigation, but it was the only thing that didn't fit, and it had bothered her from the very beginning. Miss Marple stood up, her heart racing as she quickly made her way to the cupboard in the corner of the room. She pulled out the box that contained the teacups, the set that Eliza had used when hosting visitors. As she opened the box, she counted them quickly, her fingers brushing over the porcelain. 5 cups, but no 6th cup. She had thought it lost, discarded. But now she realized that it had been hidden, not in the house, not in the room, but in the garden, beneath the hedge, where she had found the shard of porcelain earlier, the last cup, the one that had been broken. But what did it mean? Why was it hidden? Miss Marple's mind whirred as she pieced it together. The teacup had been broken not just as a sign of frustration, but as a marker. Leonard had left it there knowing someone would find it. It wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. The teacup was the final clue, the last piece of the puzzle that had never quite made sense. She picked up the shard she had found in the garden, her fingers tracing the smooth edge. Then, with a sudden understanding, she turned back to the teacup in the box. It was chipped. The edge was uneven, as if it had been hastily repaired. She had found it, the missing piece. The teacup was not a symbol of Leonard's failure. It was a symbol of something else entirely. Miss Marple picked up the phone and dialed the constable's number, her fingers steady but her mind racing. Get over to the Travers cottage, now. We've missed something. It wasn't Leonard who had been trying to rewrite his story. It wasn't even Eliza or Margaret or anyone else involved in the case. It was someone else, someone who had been in the background all along, someone who had seen the cracks in Leonard's performance and had decided to finish the story on their own terms. The constable arrived at the cottage half an hour later, his face pale and confused. "What is it, Miss Marple? What did you find?" "The last clue," she said, holding up the shard of porcelain. It's not Leonard's legacy that matters, it's his failure. He couldn't finish the story, so someone else took the last step. Someone who knew how to manipulate the pieces. Someone who was always one step ahead. The constable blinked, trying to process. But who? Miss Marple's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. The one who was always watching, the one who never spoke, the one who had been waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. She turned to the door, motioning for the constable to follow her. The story isn't over yet, not by a long shot. And as she stepped into the village night, a final thought lingered in her mind, settling like a weight in her chest. The mystery had never really ended. It had just been waiting for the right person to notice the missing piece. And now, the truth would finally be revealed. But not in the way anyone expected. The mystery would continue, and Ivy Lane would never be the same again.